2023 is already well underway. The new Congress is settling in on Capitol Hill and addressing priorities for energy policy that will deliver reliable and affordable power for consumers. We also have a shift at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission with a new acting chairman and the departure of former chairman Richard Glick, leaving a vacancy at the commission. The fallout from Winter Storm Elliott over the holidays is fresh on everyone's minds, making it even more clear that we need to address the challenges to power system reliability. You're listening to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we showcase the voices and stories behind America's changing electric grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's president and CEO. Our guest this episode is Jim Burke. Jim is the president and CEO of Vistra Corp, one of the largest competitive power companies in the United States. He's also chairman of EPSA's board of directors. So we wanted to kick off the year by talking with Jim about what's new at Vistra and priorities he has for EPSA and the competitive power sector in 2023 and beyond. Here's Jim. Jim, we're glad that you could join us today to talk a little bit about Vistra and about EPSA and what our priorities are as we look ahead to 2023. But for those that don't know, could you give us kind of elevator pitch, or why is it important that we hear your perspectives?
Yeah, sure, Todd. Vistra Corp is one of the largest competitive generators and competitive retail electric suppliers in the country. You know, we're publicly traded. We're a Fortune 500 company. We operate all the major competitive electric markets, covering 20 states and the District of Columbia. Our operations span from Maine to California, and our headquarters are in Texas. You know, our fleet is primarily a highly efficient natural gas fleet, but we also have nuclear, coal, solar, and battery facilities. And in fact, as we've been transforming our fleet, we've retired some coal plants, we've built some new solar and battery facilities. We happen to operate the largest battery facility in the world in California. We also operate the largest one in Texas. And our retail business has been noteworthy because we can offer unique plans. Like one of our most popular plans is free nights and solar days. We also have plans such as Seasons Pass, where we help customers manage through higher usage periods. These aren't offered in all markets across the country. So this has kind of been part of our heritage, and our purpose as that our people are focused on is, as we phrase it, is lighting up people's lives and powering a better way forward. And so we really want to be part of the changes that are occurring in our industry. Hopefully we can lead them. And that's a little bit about us.
That's a lot, actually. And I'm glad that you kind of talked about the breadth of where your exposure is and what you own, because I think that's really relevant when we talk about some of the issues as we look at what energy transformation looks like and how we're going to get there from here, and then really how we do it in a cost-effective fashion. So for those that maybe are a little less well-versed, not that anyone that would listen to our podcast isn't well-versed, of course, in energy, but for those that might not be, and you're sitting around the holiday dinner table, how would you describe what a competitive power generator or independent power producer is? How are you different from what people might expect from a traditional utility?
Yeah, you know, this just happened because we just got out of the holidays. So I had a couple of cracks at this, Todd, and I can't say that, you know, it's ever easy to describe because it's sort of behind the curtain stuff for a lot of people. But the way I describe it is a competitive power supplier is a business that generates electricity from a variety of sources. It could be gas, nuclear, coal, wind, sun, you know, you name it. But because we're competitive, our investors are willing to put their capital at risk without a guaranteed rate of return. And the hopes are is that if we operate well and we've made smart business decisions, then there may be a return on that investment. If we haven't, then the customer or the ratepayer is not at risk, the investor is. And I think that's a fundamental difference between the competitive markets and the regulated monopoly power supplier. So we have to innovate, we have to improve, we've got to manage our costs, we have to manage our risk, all in hopes of having a viable business. It's not an easy business, but it's what we're attracted to. It's what we think ultimately is the right answer for the electric market across the country. But we have to focus on reliability, affordability, and sustainability because our customers are demanding that of us.
Yeah. And you raised some of the issues I'm sure we're going to break down a little bit in this conversation. But before we get there, 2022 was a busy year. It was your first year at the helm of Vistra. You also got the pleasure of being your first stint as the
That's right. Yep.
and we've developed a great working relationship. So I appreciate your leadership there. What stands out to you in both of those roles as key issues that have either come up that have impacted members or that impact the broader competitive power market?
I'll probably go a little bit in chronology of the year, Todd, because I think we saw a couple things happen with, first of all, the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Sure.
And we saw what happened with energy prices and the effect that even domestic energy policy can have in how is our country positioned.
Mm-hmm.
And we obviously have tremendous resources as a country. We've got to make sure we're taking full advantage of it, and that's both on the upstream side and what we can do to source our own energy, but also the renewables investments that have been enabled through things like the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think the Inflation Reduction Act, following right there on the heels of what happened with the conflict, folks are looking at, is this a way to potentially diversify our sources of electricity? But at the same time, we finished the year with Elliott.
Mm-hmm.
And with Winter Storm Elliott, I think some of the things that folks have been concerned about started to show about reliability. And so when you put all of these together, you have to come away with this view that we've got to have a resilient and cost-effective source of energy. We need to take advantage of the policy angles and the Inflation Reduction Act to try to achieve it, but it isn't clear that those near-term opportunities are going to solve the reliability challenge. And then
Right.
Elliott, I think, exposed that there's an interdependency in our energy systems, particularly gas and power, that we have to resolve. And I think a lot of that was to be packed into 1 year is a lot to digest, but I think our work's cut out for us as an industry going forward.
Yeah, I think that is a certainty. And I think you raised one of the issues that, has been bubbling along under the surface for, I don't know, the better part of a decade in gas electric coordination. As you see the evolving resource mix and a move to a lot more natural gas fired generation to marry with renewables or non-dispatchable resources that have to work together, that certainly speaks to a number of operational challenges, but also some siting related issues, because we can't expect to continue to operate an expanding natural gas generation fleet without some additional infrastructure. And I know that was a issue in the last Congress, and it is, I'm sure, certain to be in the next Congress. Those are some of the challenges that I think are out there. How do you look at that? Because I know we've talked before and you've kind of explained about how natural gas is an enabler for greater renewable deployment. And you've got a great way of explaining that. So kind of share your thinking about how we tackle this very complicated, multifaceted issue.
Yeah, look, I have been in this industry for a little over 20 years. I think the evolution of the industry, if you look at it almost on a decade by decade basis, fuel sources have changed over time.
For sure.
Certainly, there was much more of an emphasis on coal. Decades ago, we see a lot of that retiring. Natural gas is a 50% improvement right off the bat from a carbon intensity standpoint. So I think it's a preferred fuel. But natural gas has a lot of uses beyond just the electric sector. So while we as an electric sector have a high dependence on natural gas to be a baseload resource and a flexible resource, I think that's one of the unique things that the natural gas fleet that we operate and many of the EPSA members operate. That is one of the unique things that can enable more renewables penetration, is that flexibility. At the same time, it tends to be a supply that is a just-in-time supply, because it is very difficult to store large quantities of natural gas at a plant like you could uranium for a nuclear plant or coal for a coal plant. So the coordination between these two industries, I think, is at an all-time high in terms of the need and the focus. And I think because of the amount of intermittent resources being added to the grid, the only way the consumer can be comfortable that transition is going to be a smooth one is if we can backstop it.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about reliability, I think the customer likes the idea of a wind and solar as a preferred resource. But I've not had a customer tell me that they are prepared to go without power if the wind and the solar are not available. And natural gas is the backbone of our electric grid. And during storms like Elliott, what we experienced here in Texas, what California went through in the heat wave in September, natural gas will be 60, 70, 80% of what is operating at the very critical demand periods. So what I think, Todd, what we have to do as an industry is work very tightly with the natural gas industry, with the different regulatory bodies, with policymakers on acknowledging this dependency. I think there is an element of the two are coordinated to the extent that the two want to transact and do business, but there actually is a long-term need for coordination and transparency, probably more than ever as the coal is continuing to come out of the stack. We are depending more and more on natural gas, and we're fortunate as a country to have tremendous natural gas supplies. We've got to make sure all that is deliverable, is transparent, and available to the electric system so that we can deliver the reliability that the customer expects.
You stressed reliability, and of course, that is one of EPSA's principal points of advocacy. So as reliability continues to rise and Elliott shines a very bright light onto that and perhaps brings policymakers focus onto reliability, as someone that's putting steel in the ground, you're making investments in new types of resources. What concerns do you have, or what is needed to ensure that Vistra and other EPSA members can continue to deliver power reliably and at prices?
Well, a couple things. The Inflation Reduction Act, I think, offers incentives that have both short-term and long-term opportunity. In the short term, I think we're going to see more investment in wind, solar, and battery. But we haven't seen that combination alone has been able to provide the long duration needs during critical periods, particularly these storms. So I have a concern that the Inflation Reduction Act could actually spur in the near term more investment in things that might even be more difficult to work through from a reliability standpoint. And I put that on the time frame of, let's say, now to 2030, the early 2030s, where I think new nuclear, carbon capture sequestration, some hydrogen-based storage solutions that we could look at might be able to play a role, but those are not right on our doorstep, Todd. So when we put new steel in the ground, one of the concerns I have is that the wind and the solar have the ability to effectively receive two payments. They receive a payment from the grid, the electric grid, a competitive electric grid. They also effectively receive a payment from the taxpayer. And that enables those resources to bid at what is effectively a below market cost. And they can still be, quote, profitable as to their investors. Well, the gas units that are there to backstop those only receive one payment. It comes from the competitive electric market. Yet the customer is wholly dependent on the reliability of that system and the integrity of that system remaining in place. So the number one thing I'm worried about is as we continue to build out these carbon-free resources, they should be there if they're there, but they should also be there in a way that isn't putting at risk the resources that we need when they're not there.
That's right.
And I think, and we're seeing that happen, Todd, with some of the early retirements of the coal units. I think coal will obviously continue to retire, but the pacing matters. That's right. I think what we're seeing is that some of those are being economically challenged, but they're actually still needed in some cases for reliability. That's happening and will continue to happen to the natural gas fleet if we don't recognize that. So I think there is a reliability standard that could turn into an expectation of the electric grid where resources can be paid for bringing reliability, which includes it comes on when you want to turn it on because you turn it on because you need it. And if we only have a grid based on when natural resources like the wind and the sun are available, that may not line up with when the customer needs it. So we got to recognize that. And if it's there, it should operate. It should go effectively first in line.
Yep.
But if it isn't there, we've got to have that backstop. And that's, Todd, is what we talk about. That's obviously what our industry is trying to bring as a level of awareness, is that what's going on behind the curtain matters.
Yeah.
And that you need this backstop to be there.
And there's a cost to reliability. And there's, it's important for consumers to recognize that, because, if you undervalue or you undercompensate much needed resources, they have the incentive to actually exit and jeopardize reliability. So it's a market function to solve that equation, to be sure.
And Todd, I would add that when we talk about competitive markets, it isn't just about competing about who can bring electric supply to the grid the cheapest. It's also who brings it in an affordable way and in a increasingly cleaner way. But competition in competitive markets enables customers to see price signals, and to actually respond. Now, we tend to see the response when the grid gets tight and prices go up. Industrial customers are usually some of the first to respond, commercial customers as well, but even residential customers that we have on plans that incentivize customers to use less during certain periods and more during other periods. The competitive market framework should provide these price signals to both suppliers and customers. That helps keep a grid in balance. If you're actually asking people to use less of something and the price never changes, we're not sending the right signal at critical periods of time. And so not every customer wants to respond to the price signals, but certainly some of them see it in their best interest too, because they can save money and use power when it's cheaper. That doesn't happen in most vertically integrated markets. That's a function of a competitive market that I think addresses not just the supply side, but the demand side.
Yeah, it's actually a feature, not a bug of the competitive market, because it actually allows people to change their behavior as they think it's appropriate. And and it kind of leads me into my next question for you, is energy prices are top of mind. As you know, the conflict in Ukraine created some price shocks for natural gas and what have you. There's market volatility, as some would describe it, given inflation and other events. And some have argued that competitive power markets drive up costs for consumers. In fact, a widely read national publication just ran a story following that theme. And we, of course, have real issues with that. But I'm curious, A, is that true? And B, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, Todd, not only is it not true, I think it goes against all logic that customers have in every other category. If you ask a customer, would they rather have one choice or more than one choice? People say more than one choice. In all the other categories we have, when more people are competing for your business, then that means that you as a customer have leverage and you have a chance to take the best option. We've seen in multiple markets across the country that you have seen the wholesale power cost drift down as more and more efficient assets have been built. And that has come through a competitive cycle of innovation. And you should see that the most efficient assets run first and the least efficient run last. They're only there when needed. That drives down power prices, right? Consumers having a choice of multiple providers that are competing for their business drives down price. Where the story gets murky, and I think the reason why it's almost a game of timing of when you want to write stories, is competitive markets respond to price signals generally more quickly than regulated markets do. So if you have a natural gas intense power generation fleet, you'll see the price of power rise more quickly. That sends signals too for consumers and for businesses to respond to. But when prices fall, gas prices fall like they have right now, you see natural gas prices come off really hard. You're seeing the competitive price signals come down extremely quickly. And that's just part of a competitive market design. The other thing you see in these competitive markets is some of them have been the most prolific with the renewables build out. And there's been additional transmission costs, which is all part of a regulated part of the market design. That goes up as you build out more and more of the renewables. So some of the cleanest electric grids are actually the competitive electric grids. And there are two costs there. There's the resource cost itself, and then there's the transmission costs that go in. All of that gets jumbled into the storyline. And I think you saw that in the most recent article.
Exactly.
That just came out. But I would say, again, common sense, and I think empirical evidence shows the more people competing, the more people that want your business, the lower the prices go, the better service you get, the more options you have, the better features you have. Anybody that says that's not the case, I would say would not be consistent with all the other categories that they buy every single day. And electricity is no different.
Yeah. As you noted in some of your comments, EPSA members have been at kind of the leading edge of bringing reliable generation to market with newer and cleaner technologies as it becomes commercially viable, which I think is an important thing to remember. And you've been an example of that with critical gas resources, but also the battery resources that you talked about in California and Texas. And as you look over the horizon a bit, how is Vistra looking to the future, and how are you balancing that call for reduced emissions or lower carbon resources with the need for reliable generation?
Todd, it is a great question. If you look at what we have done and said publicly, we have our own reduction goal for greenhouse gases, 60% reduction goal. From 2010 to 2030. We're already 3/4 of the way there. So that has been largely achieved through retirement of older coal units. Mm-hmm. But we also know that the grid needs additional supply. So we have been investing in solar and battery. As noted earlier, I think through my comments, they're not one-for-one replacements.
Yeah.
And I think the question then becomes, if you take a coal unit off or a gas unit off, just how much wind, solar, and battery is needed to probabilistically replace the output of the coal and the gas plant. And depending on the different studies you look at, it can be a multiple of 4-to-1, 5-to-1 kind of nameplate comparisons. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at the capital required to transform the electric grid in the United States, there are estimates that we may need upwards of $1 trillion a year invested in generation and transmission in order to have the reliability and the sustainability aspects people are looking for. Well, I don't know how you attract $1 trillion to be invested unless there's a potential for a return and that people feel like it's worth investing in that structure. And so that's where our investors are asking us, which is, are we able to see an investment return in your solar and battery investments? What if you were to build a new gas plant? Is the market accepting of that? Is the investing public accepting of that? Is society accepting of that? Yep. And I think we need to get comfortable as an industry that we need all forms of generation, that this is not an either or. I think the minute we go down to an either or, we create a vulnerability and a resiliency issue for our own economy. I think we should be open-minded. And if we can put carbon capture, sequestration, and other elements to this to work, maybe we can have the resiliency of the grid through some of the current fossil resources or new fossil resources with some of the sustainability aspects people are looking for. So I think it's an evolution, Todd. I think we've got to be very thoughtful about how rapidly we go into this transformation, because we do not want to jeopardize reliability, especially, as you said, potentially any other economic impacts as a result of trying to achieve simply the sustainability objective and losing sight of the reliability objective.
Yeah. You talked about competition, and maybe to ask the direct question, what's needed to drive that competitive investment in those new and innovative technologies?
Yeah. So Todd, in order to see the competitive market deliver on its full promise and then have the investment dollars be attracted to it, I think it takes a stable regulatory framework. Investors are not seeking, in our company and a lot of the EPSA members, they're not seeking guaranteed rates of return. Mm-hmm. They're seeking a common set of market rules that provide a framework to say, okay, I know the rules under which I'm investing Now we need to operate extremely well,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a chance to get a return. So when you look at some of the markets that we operate in, there are always changes to rules. They might be caps being put in on certain bids. It might be how the capacity market looks at renewables versus some of the dispatchable. It could be how transmission decisions are being made and who bears the cost of those. I think there needs to be some stability in this framework because it feels like year to year, EPSA, you and your organization are always looking at what tweak here or tweak there that other stakeholders are trying to make that creates a shifting landscape that scares off investment. And so I think that's one of the most important things that each of these markets that are looking to attract capital need to be looking at it from the standpoint that these are 20, 30, 40-year life assets.
That's right.
And we're not simply optimizing what's on the ground today. A lot of what's on the ground today will retire. And we've got to attract new. That's this $1 trillion number.
That's right.
That I was mentioning. And so the only way you can attract capital is if people think they have some sense of what the rules of the game are. And I think that is not well understood because I think people think that we're only talking about the assets that are here and now and how are they going to operate.
Yeah.
When you fast forward 2030, 2040, 2050, we're going to have to attract so much new capital because electrification, it's not just about today's demand levels, it's how the decarbonization of the whole US economy is looking to unfold. And it's about more electricity being consumed, which is going to come with a cleaner overall environmental footprint for the country. So we've got to attract more capital to meet higher demand levels. So I think that stability, Todd, is what has most investors nervous, is because the vertically integrated model appears more stable to them and so you see that the value placed on those companies is quite high.
Sure.
When you come into a competitive company situation like ours, the investors are saying, I need a potential of a higher return because of the unpredictability of the market design.
Yep.
If we can actually bring the predictability of the market rules to a level of clarity, the required return will come down. Yep. And then we can attract cheaper capital, build more assets. But those two have a direct relationship, Todd, and I think we've got to recognize that as we try to attract capital.
Yeah, given the changes that the markets have had over the last several years, I think I would take a tweak over a sometimes very significant alteration of the market. Your point's a fair one. You talk about innovation, and at the end of the year last year, there was some significant news about fusion as a potential energy source. That I think most folks understand that that's still decades away, but how do you see that as a potential future item? Is that the kind of R&D that, is, where we should be investing, or things that you look at? Or do you take kind of that's really nice, but we're still so far away that it's an item that we'll keep on the back burner while we focus on these short and medium term goals?
Yeah, Todd, I think it's a great example of when the government decides that there is some really promising technologies that we could study, like fusion, and with federal support, real progress has been made. I think that's a very appropriate and important part of how the country can be a leader in these technologies that can help us transform, our whole energy system. Companies like ours are generally about commercializing technologies, right? That is the basis of what we do. So yes, fusion is, by almost anybody's view, decades away. I think new nuclear around the small modular reactors, advanced reactors, there's 8 to 10 pilots going right now, realistically. And of course, that's fission, not fusion, but that's realistically something that maybe in the early 2030s could be an opportunity for a company like ours. But I think the role of government in that early stage development makes a lot of sense. I think there's a question as to once you have mature technologies, like we have on some of the renewable technologies, should they have the same federal support and backing? Because I'd rather see the marketplace sort those out because they're commercially viable technologies.
Right.
Let's let them compete. And if we have to put a price on carbon somewhere, somehow, let's do that because that's something that would advantage one technology over the other. But we're in this point now where we've got, as I mentioned, 2 payment streams coming on some mature technologies and 1 payment stream coming for other mature technologies. That does not happen in most other large-scale industries. It's not happening, generally speaking, when you go to the grocery store. It's not happening to the same extent in your telecom and your wireless experience. But in energy right now, that's become our national policy. We need to recognize that I think that new technologies need that federal support to get off the ground. And I think the reason the labs and the DOE are there make a lot of sense. Once we get to these mature technologies, I think we've got to look at how do they stand on their own and compete.
Right. At some point, the spigot probably needs to be turned off. And if you're really the least cost resource, you're going to run, you're going to earn the revenue you need. And that's how it should function. So
that's right. And if you're the most reliable resource, you should be rewarded for that.
Exactly.
And I think the customer has to define reliability, Todd. I think that's the thing that we have to keep in mind is that when the customer needs it, they need it.
Yeah.
They don't want to wait on it. They don't want to go without. And I think starting with that customer focused view, you can measure the technologies and reward them accordingly.
That's right. As I like to I used to say, I don't say it as often anymore, but customers really wanted 3 things. They want their lights on, their beer cold, and their water warm. And that hasn't really changed. And so I think that's true. So, I want to ask a little a question that maybe seems like it's a one-off, but it's really one of the important issues that we're facing in light of global events and things that we're seeing here in the U.S. And that's talking about cyber and physical security, of course.
Yep.
And EPSA participates as the competitive power generation sector's representative on the electricity sector coordinating council. There's so many acronyms, it's hard to keep them all straight, but the ESCC. And we sit at that table to represent our industry's interests and to partner with our government entities. Talk a little bit, if you would, both about the importance of our engagement with our government partners, but also how you are, as a asset owner, looking at physical and cyber related security. Because at its core, that's a reliability function. Because if you have a physical or a cyber incident, you can't operate, and that means we've got a reliability issue.
Yeah, Todd, I think this is on the minds of leadership teams of regulated and competitive companies. I know it's certainly on the minds of the boards of directors, at our various companies, including ours.
Mm-hmm.
It is ultimately a reliability concern, right? Everybody is looking at what is the most vulnerable part of the system. And I think cyber attacks got a lot of attention over the last couple of years, not just in our industry, but others, some of them, as you know, pipeline related. We've seen more recently physical attacks at the substation level. It is going to be extremely difficult for the system to harden each and every asset across an entire network of assets. Mm-hmm. However, there's a role that each still has to play to harden those assets. And then we have to have the resilience to not be single asset dependent. And I think that is where the role that NERC has been elevating this topic, as you know, and we have standards that we have to comply with, that the industry complies with. And I think at the end of the day, we cannot, if you look at it purely from a competitive market standpoint, we are wholly dependent on being reliable. We effectively only are compensated if we're performing. There is no regulatory backstop for our model. So I would argue this is as much a priority for our businesses as any in the system, because our entire revenue model depends on it. So there's been a lot of great sharing across the industry when these events occur. What are the lessons learned? We've had great sharing with FERC and others around some of the cyber issues that the industry has faced. And this is a real investment that our members are committed to address, because it ultimately does turn into a reliability and an economic risk for the country and trust and credibility of our customer base. And so this is a key aspect. It's one we're highly focused on. I can tell you anywhere from a nuclear plant to a transformer at a solar farm, this is a topic of conversation for us.
You've been very generous with your time, Jim. So I'm going to just close with a couple of quick questions for you. You can determine how detailed you want to be in your answers, but we're seating a new Congress and we're going to be operating in a little different political environment here in Washington with a divided government. If you were a new member of Congress, what would you be focused on, or what would you advise new members of Congress to be focused on with regard to the energy space?
Yeah, I think reliability is the key topic. And Todd, I give you and EPSA credit for getting out on this message where we had smaller reliability concerns that have occurred over the last several years. And it's been a topic where many times I think it's been just taken for granted because there's been enough excess capacity on the grid as the new stuff has come on, the old stuff was still on.
Yep.
Now we're seeing that enough old is coming off the grid and the new that's coming on doesn't have all the same characteristics as the old that's coming off.
Yep.
And I think at the end of the day, I have seen elected officials take a real interest in this topic, regardless of their political affiliation. And I think it's a unifying concern. And I think it's a significant concern that whether it's a regulated marketplace or a competitive, each has had struggles as recently as Elliott.
Yep.
And it doesn't extend just to the power system, but also the gas system. And so I would ask enough questions if I were, a new member of Congress or I have a chance to influence the discussion, is dig deep on to get the basic understanding, because it is a complex topic and I do not want to oversimplify the topic. It takes tenacity. It takes kind of an intellectual curiosity to dig into it. There are a lot of great experts that can assist. But it is the key, I think, to getting to the right policy decisions that we balance this reliability with the affordability and sustainability objectives. But we've got time here, I think, with the changes being made, new members in Congress and new leadership, to have a fresh discussion on this. And I know EPSA and its members are willing to roll up its sleeves and talk about, what ideas we have that can help improve the reliability of the system. But each of us has a role to play, Todd. I don't think it's about looking elsewhere. I think we have to look at ourselves and what we can do as individual members, but also what we can do collectively. And we're prepared to engage at every level to do that. It's that important.
Yeah, and I echo your sentiment that this is a nonpartisan issue. Energy is important to every American, and we ought to all care about its reliability and how we achieve that in a way that people can afford it. So with that, I'll close with one last question, Jim, and I'll ask, what's on tap in Vistra's near-term future that you're excited about? Is there a new project you want to announce on our podcast, or are there just things underway that are things that you think are important that you'd like to highlight as you look at what you have in store for 2023?
Yeah, look, as a publicly traded company, I don't know if this podcast
there'll be no breaking news on this podcast
as Reg FD compliant. But look, I would say what we're excited about, Todd, is that our business has expanded considerably over the last several years. And we see an integration of our business with the entire trend in the industry.
Yep.
And our people are excited about it. I mean, when I told you we have retirement of coal units, one just retired the first of this year. Okay. Yeah. It's very difficult to go through those decisions and still have the impacts, that it's going to have on our people. At the same time, we're nearly doubling the size of the battery out in California. I told you is already the world's largest.
Right.
And we've got plans to be doing additional investments across our system. And so we're excited about that transformation. But it comes with the seriousness that we are a 24/7 essential service. We pride ourselves in that. And I think if this is the kind of business with the purpose I mentioned at the beginning, that's exciting for people, this is a great industry, but it has real meaning. And that's what I think we're excited about, Todd. But we have a big lift ahead of us on these topics that we've covered here in the podcast, and our people are excited about it. Don't be surprised if there aren't some announcements from Vistra along the way during the year.
Sure.
But we're excited about this topic, that this topic is actually getting the attention that I think it deserves. And we're excited about working through the solutions.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim. We appreciate your time, and know that this conversation is an important one, and one that we will continue to drill down on over the course of the year. So thanks again for joining us.
Todd, I appreciate what you and your organization are doing. It's vitally important.
There's no shortage of work to do. Stay tuned for how
There's no
EPSA
shortage
and
of
others are
work to
addressing
do.
the issues
Stay
we
tuned
covered
for how
in this
EPSA and
conversation.
others are addressing the
And if you're in
issues we
DC
covered
in
in
March,
this conversation.
join us to hear representatives
And if you're in
from
DC
Vistra
in March,
and our member
join us to hear
companies,
representatives
innovators,
from
and
Vistra
other energy
and our member
experts at our
companies,
second annual
innovators, and
Competitive
other
Power
energy
Summit.
experts at our
Registration is
second
now
annual
open on our
Competitive Power
website
Summit.
Registration is now
EPSA.org.
open on our website.
Thanks for
at
listening to Energy
EPSA.org.
Solutions.
If you like this
Thanks for
episode,
listening to Energy
please share it on
Solutions.
social media.
If you like
or
this
with your
episode,
coworkers,
please
friends,
share it on
and
social
family.
media.
You
or
can
with
also
your
connect with
coworkers,
us on
friends, and
Twitter
family.
at EPSA
You can
News,
also
and
connect
on
with us
LinkedIn
on Twitter
and
at
subscribe,
EPSA News,
follow,
and on
leave a
LinkedIn.
rating or comment
And subscribe,
on Spotify,
follow,
Pandora,
leave a rating
Google,
or comment
or wherever
on
you listen to
Spotify,
podcasts.
Pandora, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.